I I'm going to be a student here tonight because having listened to a video by where Professor Mohammed spoke about the Indo and the Indo and Afro Guyanese in the 19th century, and put it in a context of how labor or how the laborers were marginalized, especially African Guyanese were marginalized to keep labor costs down, to ensure that the cost of sugar from Guyana was competitive on the market, the world market, with Brazil and Cuba. I don't want to spend too much time on that. I want to start the show, and but just a brief moment. Those who are joining us for the first time, CWS is about having conversations with people about their journeys. How are they using their gifts and talents to help others? And how are they making a positive contribution to humanity? I'll take a short break, and when I return, I will introduce you to Professor Wazir Mohamed. We are back. Good evening. I'm Selwyn Collins of CWS Conversations with Selwyn. The gentleman next to me is Professor Wazir Mohamed. Professor, good evening, sir.
Good evening, Selwyn. How are you doing today?
I am fine, thank you, and thanks for appearing on CWS.
Oh, I must thank you for asking me to appear.
I just want to give our audience a glimpse of your bio. Assistant Professor Sociology, Humanities, and Social Sciences. Education,
Binghamton, yeah.
Binghamton, sorry. Binghamton University, State University of New York. 2008 Ph.D. in Sociology. Dissertation, Frustrated Peasant, Marginalized Workers, Freed African Villages of Guyana, 1838 to 1885. 2003 MA in Sociology. University of Guyana, 1998 BSc Communication, Honors. Best graduating student with a degree in communications. Received the Forte Plus Club Communication Award, set aside by the University of Guyana for the top student in the communication degree program. 1995 Diploma in Public Communications. Best graduating student with Diploma in Public Communications, awarded the Victor Forsyth Communication Prize. This award is set aside for the top student in the communication class. And then in 1979, Critchlow Labor College, Guyana, diploma in industrial and social studies. I want to leave it off there, and get on with the show. Professor, I invited you because I'm curious about Guyana's history, especially in the context of indentureship and post-emancipation. I hope that by the end of this conversation, we not only get to know a bit more about you, but come away with a better understanding of the racial divide in Guyana. It is also my hope that this conversation sets a new and amicable tone to the discussion on racial division we as Guyanese must have if we are to exorcise the demons that haunt us and keep us divided to this day. So let me start with this. Can you give us a historical perspective of the Mohammeds? What can you tell us about the origins of your family?
Well, I mean, we are from a small village on the east bank of the Essequibo River. We are bordered by farm village. Our family was heavily involved in the anti-colonial movement. So I grew up in a kind of political family. But more than that, I grew up in an Indian Guyanese Muslim family that had always had very close relations with African people. Mm-hmm. And so I come from that background. I was born in the late 1950s. And so in my early years as a very young person, I really, as a child, witnessed the racial riots of the 1960s. I still have memories of some of those images in my head and the kinds of mobilization and activities that your parents had to engage in to protect family, to protect the village, to protect people, to give people solace, to rescue people who were displaced as a result of the riots in the 1960s. So I grew up in that kind of climate. Another Another example of my experience is the fact that one of the persons, first Africans who were killed in the racial riots of the 1960s, was a very close friend of my father. I mean, he did not have a racial bone in his being, but was killed just because he was African. And he was killed on the day when he was coming to our home with his donkey cart, and just for the fact that he was black. And you know, I grew up with that kind of memory. And then as I began to examine what I would do when I went through high school, I became involved in the political movement. I first was involved in the Progressive Youth Organization, and had very close relationship with youth groups in the country. In fact, I went to represent Guyana at the World Youth Festival in Cuba in 1978, which was a unified group of young Guyanese who were sent by Guyana, not by any political party, to represent the country in Cuba for 2 weeks in 1978. I also became a member of the People's Progressive Party. And then I was also a worker in Georgetown in the late 1970s and became involved in the trade union movement, and was involved in the leadership at the leadership level of the Clerical and Commercial Workers Union, one of the strongest trade unions in Guyana at that time. So my background is varied. I then became involved with Walter Rodney and the Working People's Alliance late 1979, and then my political history, then veered off as a history of working as an activist within the Working People's Alliance to build a multiracial future for the country.
Professor, before you continue, I wanna take a journey into your timeline a little bit before we get into that, because I have some questions about that period of your life.
Yeah.
What is your fondest memory of your parents as a child?
My fondest memory of my parents as a child, we were a farming family.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were kind of doing everything together. We would go to the farm together. We lived that kind of happy life as an independent farming family. But the memories that are lasting for me is the fact that there was no distinction, there was no racial distinction in my family, so that there was a relationship with black farmers, which was equal to the relationship that my parents had with East Indian farmers. And in fact, my father had, I think, the closest friends and closest relations that my father had was with black farmers, who would, at that time of growing up, and one of, and my memory is people lending their labor out. So, I mean, some of the black farmers would lend their labor out to my father, and then my father would lend his labor out to them.
I think I remember that.
That was the kind of culture within which I grew up.
Yeah. I grew up until I was 9 in a place called Virgin Nugent. And
I'm living 2 miles from Virginia.
Yeah, I can vaguely remember that lending of labor. I didn't realize that's what it was called at the time. From soccer coaching, youth organizations, cricket committee, you seem to be always involved in organizing and teaching from the young to the old. What are you organizing these days?
Well, I mean, these days I'm mostly involved in the academic community here. Mm-hmm. Apart from teaching classes on inequality and sociology classes and on race and on food and stuff like that, I also organize diversity events on the campus and in the community and involve the community. Up to last year, at the beginning of last year, I ended 4 years of service to the city of Richmond here as the chairman of its Human Rights Commission. So, I mean, I also participate in a committee here in the city of Richmond with the Christian churches called the Christian of Abraham Study Committee, in which what we do is that we examine the linkages between Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. And we try to build unity among different groups. So I'm always involved at some communal level.
How was growing up in the 60s and witnessing those riots, the strikes, and I would say the combustible racial tensions between the two main ethnic groups, and how did those experiences shape who you became at age 14, then at 24?
Well, I mean, I mean, at age 14, I really didn't know what I was going to do. And in fact, even when I came out to study, I did not know I was going to do a PhD. I mean, but I always knew that that I had a passion to find answers to the problems that I have experienced. And so, I mean, my trajectory has been a trajectory towards developing community relations that were multiracial, in which young people would not feel debarred because of their race or because of their class from access to activities. And so my involvement in community cricket in the 70s and in the 80s and in the 90s had to do with bringing cricket to the East Bank Essequibo area and to ensure that all young people had equal access. And I did that with a passion. In everything that I have done in my life has been about finding space so that everybody, regardless of their condition, regardless of their race, can feel that they're acceptable. And so, I mean, my passion, and that is my passion in life.
We seem to be having some problems with your videos, so I'm going to put a photo of you in the meanwhile so we can continue with the show. Take us into the 70s with Dr. Walter Rodney, his ideology, his philosophy, and his politics. What drew you, a young Indian man, to him, a young African man?
Because he was, I mean, what I saw in him was this person who did not have race. He was like, basically, I mean, he was the kind of leader that I was looking for. And because, I mean, what I saw, I mean, I'll give you an example. I was working in the private sector in Georgetown in that period. And when he was released from prison, from jail, after he was arrested for the fire at the Ministry of National Development, and I was on the street in front of the Georgetown Magistrates Court that day, and what I witnessed was the fact that you had these throngs of young people of all races who embraced him and began to follow him, and a march developed, a complete multiracial march which was not organized, of young people of all races and creeds. And they held him on their shoulder, and they marched him to the Merriman's Mall, which later was renamed the Walter Rodney Mall. And they demanded that he address them. For me, that represented a people's movement, where young people were showing that they have the capacity to change and to move forward. And Walter Rodney was a catalyst, because he did not have a message for the Indian people that was separate from his message to the African people. He had one message to all Guyanese, that they can only be free and independent if they were to band together as one people. And that was basically his message, that working people needed to come together, needed to understand their history. Later, as I began to read his work, especially the history of the Guyanese working people, which undoubtedly is the best historical document that has been written about Guyana up to this point, he gave equal space in that work to the condition of the African working people and to the East Indian working people. and he drew the comparisons of them working together. We must remember, Selwyn, that the first time that there was any real major confrontation between these two major ethnic groups in the country was the 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
East Indians have been in Guyana since 1838. But the first time between 1838 and the 1960s was the first time there was any major confrontation between Africans and East Indians in Guyana. Over that whole period, there were levels of cooperation,
mm-hmm.
because the working people, the working Africans and the working East Indians understood that both groups were caught up in this situation, and their situation was no different from the other. One was no different from the other.
Yeah, go ahead.
And so Walter Rodney's scholarship have to do with his deep understanding of that unity that existed. And that is the passion that drove him. And in fact, that is the passion that caused him to be killed. Because, that itself is a power. To have that passion and to carry that passion forward into the political process is itself very strong.
And talking about his death, how in 1980, how did that impact your life in your later years?
Well, at that point, the impact was to continue the struggle, was to continue his work and to make it work. Mm-hmm. And so what we did is that we picked the movement up, we redeveloped the movement, we reorganized the movement. And between 1980 and the time of the 1992 elections, the Working People's Alliance, the party of Walter Rodney, became the most popular political movement in the country. And that had to do with the work that we did after he was killed. We led the struggle against the food bans. We led the struggle for free and fair elections. We were the people who were doing most of the mobilization in the country in that period between 1980 and 1990, going up to 1992.
And to your main question, is there an answer to the racial divide in Guyana?
Yeah, but the answer to the racial divide cannot be a quick answer.
Mm-hmm.
Because it took the racial divide evolved. It's structural. It did not. It wasn't a conspiracy. It arose as a result of the economic circumstances of the country. When the East Indians were brought in the 1840s and the 1850s, and then they were brought in more numbers in the 1860s, and then continued until 1917. We must remember that the African working people had not, and this is a point that Walter Rodney makes in his writings, and this is where history is written. And I've just had an article published in a book called The Second Slavery, which was just published. I just received this yesterday, which was published in Germany. And I made a presentation at the University of Cologne in Germany in 2012, in which I made the point that the way history has been written is wrong, because history is written says that the African working people walked away from the sugar industry. They never did. In the 1840s, what they did was that they said that they needed better working conditions. And they organized as trade unions in the 1840s and won important gains. The importation of indentured labor had to do with those gains. The Portuguese indentured immigrants were brought in, first of all, and then later it was found that because they were closest to whites, that it was easy to give them the kind of facilities so that they could become a buffer group between the African population and the whites. And so they developed as the middle class in the country. And And then the East Indians were brought in large numbers. And between the Portuguese and the East Indians, the planter class had what it needed in order to break the solidarity of the African working people. And so when the Africans went on strike in 1847-48 for better working conditions, their demands were not acceded to. The planter class decided that they were going to reduce the wages down from the figure where it was in 1846 and 1847 back to where it was in 1832. And so the African working class decided that they could not work for starvation wages. The East Indian indentured laborers, who were captive labor because they were contract laborers, they came on contract. They were tied to plantations. They were not slaves, but I mean, in the writings of people, of some people, they have been described as their condition has been described as worse than slavery in some circumstances, because they were tied to plantations. So the African working people between 1850 and up to the 1880s could only get jobs on the sugar plantations when there were not enough East Indian labor. And so the conditions in the African villages worsened as a result of that. So we have to understand that the history is important, and this history needs to be studied and needs to be taught in our schools.
So, what do you believe are some factors that contribute to the deep distrust between Afro and Indo-Guyanese?
Well, the distrust developed over the struggle for power in the 1960s. We must remember that there was a national movement in the early 1950s, in which there was a unified political movement in which the leadership of the African community and the leadership of the Indian community participated together politically in the People's Progressive Party before it was split. You see, before the PNC was formed in the 1950s. But it is the distrust developed as a result of the struggle for power. And then the struggle for power emerged between the PVP and the PNC. And in a sense, Africans began to coalesce around the PNC and East Indians began to coalesce around the PVP. So the distrust have to do, remember, we have a situation where Indians have a slight majority in the country and Africans are in a slight minority in the country. They're like probably about 38% or thereabout of the population. And so the problem with countries like Guyana is that it has not evolved a political system that addresses these divisions and that allows for everyone, every group to feel acceptable or to feel that they have a stake in the political process. A couple of years ago, I published an article in a book called Social Justice, Poverty and Race, in which I talked about what are the limits of Western democracy as applied to Guyana. And I talked in that article about how a country like Mauritius, with a certain kind of similar history as Guyana, was able to develop a consensual political system in order to address the question of how to deal with the problems of power, especially when you have entrenched majorities and large minority groups in the population who feel marginalized.
Steve Biko said the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Why or how does that resonate with you, Professor?
Well, it is. And Steve Biko is correct, and Steve Biko is one of my heroes, because South Africa would have been a better place today if Steve Biko was alive. South Africa is a very corrupt society, and the leadership there is very corrupt. And so people like Steve Biko, Steve Biko is, I mean, they come from the same kind of generation as Walter Rodney, where they believe in the true power of the working people. The problem with what he is saying is that unless people are educated, then they're not going to be conscious of their own condition and their own situation. I mean, what is the difference between the condition of the African working people in Guyana and the condition of the Indian working people? There is not much difference. But those two groups do not understand in a real sense that there is not much difference between themselves. Mm-hmm. And that is part of our problem. Part of our problem is that we have a culture where there is no discussion between groups. People do not participate together and try to understand each other's condition. I have the experience that I have because I grew up in a situation where I was close to an African village and was able to participate equally with young people of African descent. Mm-hmm. And we had respect for each other. And so part of my work has to do with trying to recapture that history. And as I did that, Selwyn, and I'm going to digress here a little, as I was doing the research for my PhD, I decided to have a chat with my mother who turned 88 this year. Mm-hmm. And I said to her, I want you to tell me something about the African village. What was the African village like when you came here? And my mother and father were the first two persons to come and live in our village. And you know what she said? She said that the African village, that people were planting, that it was prosperous, that everybody was doing stuff, that they were working. And I said, well, so what's happening today? Why are the villages the way it is? And she said she doesn't know. You see? Mm-hmm. I then went and I spoke to a young East Indian boy who now would be in his 40s. And this was about 12 years ago. And I said to him, explain to me why our village, which is Ladystain, is it's cultivated with rice, and why the African village next door, which is farm, is not cultivated. And he said probably because the people there are lazy. So I then said to him, so tell me something about yourself. What do you do for a living? And he said, look, I am driving a truck. And I said, what? I said, but you have land. How come you're driving a truck? He said, but I can't live off the land because the small amount of land that my father has left me, I can't make a living from that. Good? And he has between 20 or 40 acres of land. He cannot make a living from it. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, how much land do you think the average African person have in the villages? He said, I don't know. I said, well, you need to find out. I said, let me tell you that the average African person in the villages have about probably an acre. Good? But that acre is divided up in small parcels. You see, when you go back in the history, and now if the East Indians cannot make a living from 20 acres of land, how could an African who has an acre make a living from an acre of land in today's condition? Now, when I examined this thing much more closely, and I went back and I looked at the National Archives, I went to the British National Archives and I looked at how the villages of Victoria and Buxton and these villages were formed in the first place. The original owners had bought these villages to farm as cooperative enterprises. They bought them and they pooled their resources and bought them to farm as cooperative enterprises, because when you pool resources together, in the conditions of Guyana, resource pooling becomes important because Guyana have a specific drainage and irrigation problem. It has a hydraulic problem. Drainage and irrigation is very costly. And so what you find is that the villagers could not really make a living from the villages in the 19th century because the villages were always flooded because they could not afford the cost of drainage and irrigation while the plantations could have. Now, apart from that, the colonial government decided that they were going to pass land laws in 1851 and 1856 to force the villages to divide up the land in small parcels. So the original shareholders could not get their share of land in one place. They had to get their share of land in different parts of the villages. And Alan Adamson dealt with that and talked about how that became a millstone around the necks of the African population. So when we're trying to understand the history, we have to try to understand the history based on the resource availability, because resource availability is very important.
Mm-hmm.
So the African population, yeah, they have these villages, but what attempts are being made to ensure that the villages are workable? I mean, the villages still exist. You still have original ownership, but the people who own these parcels, the parcels are very small. In the conditions of today, it is very difficult for a small person to make a living from these small parcels of land, unless there is an arrangement to create cooperatives, to create cooperations, to ensure that people can pool resources.
Let's take a quick break. And when we return, I want you to answer this question. Why is understanding indentureship and post-emancipation so important to the discussion of racial divisions in Guyana?
Yeah, no problem.
All right.